So that's that. What are some of the pros, right? What are some of the benefits, right? As I said, I'm going to try and be as objective as possible. It's not the case that states, organizations should never, ever negotiate with terrorists or hostage takers. There are some problems in doing so. However, there might be some benefits as well, and what I want to do now is discuss some of the benefits of actually negotiating with hostage takers. The first benefit that we might have in negotiating with hostage takers is that there is no statistically viable data suggesting that negotiations result in greater vulnerability, right? There isn't any statistical data that, up until the point of publication, 2000, that definitively demonstrated, unequivocally, that negotiation makes a state more vulnerable. It's more of an intuition. And as academics, academics don't like, unless you're an ethicist, with the exclusion of ethicists, academics, statisticians, conflict resolutionists, peacemakers, we stay away from sort of intuitive arguments, right? We want statistically verifiable, quantifiable, demonstrable proof that negotiating with hostage takers directly results in the increased vulnerability of the state, and that data just does not exist, right? So someone defending the pro for hostage negotiation refutes the second claim against hostage negotiation, right? So someone defending this stance says that this is false, right? Argues someone defending hostage negotiation would argue at an international level, not a sort of interpersonal level. Someone defending hostage negotiation as a benefit, as a tool that the state can use, would argue that those saying that it weakens the state lack sufficient statistical data to support the claim that it actually does weaken the state. It makes the state more vulnerable. Obviously then, if we're talking about increased vulnerability of the state, we're talking about a substitution effect, not a displacement effect. And I know I'm sort of spitting jargon rather heavy, but it's important to recognize the difference, right? If the state is going to be continually attacked, then we're not talking about a displacement effect. We're talking about a substitution effect, because the state is itself still a target of the terrorist organization. And the argument, to be technical, is that in bargaining-dependent terrorist attacks, if the government satisfies those terrorist attacks, there's a greater likelihood for substitution effects or reattacks, right? Even if strategies are employed to increase defense. Whereas one of the cons says, no, that's false, right? There is no statistically verifiable, demonstrable evidence that suggests that if hostage demands are met, that the state becomes increasingly vulnerable. So, you know, who's right, who's wrong, doesn't really matter. What's more important is that you understand both sides of the argument. One side says that negotiating with hostages makes the state more vulnerable. The other side says there isn't any evidence demonstrating that negotiating with terrorists makes the state more vulnerable. So that's what's at stake here. And then number two, compromise and negotiation are not to be confused with concession, right? So that there's essentially someone who's in defense of negotiation strategies. They would say that compromise and negotiation aren't the same as concession. Insofar as I'm compromising, it's not that I'm giving up. Concession meaning giving up, losing, right? The diffusion of power. They don't say that in here, but the concession is a loss of power. Power is being transferred from the state to the individual, right? Thus, governments have an ability to restrict their involvement, right? So that it isn't this black and white. There's a lot of gray. And they're saying that compromise does not equal concession, right? The argument is that compromise does not equal concession. Okay, so the pros and cons of hostage negotiation, obviously all of which are bargaining dependent, right? All of which are bargaining dependent. First, it confers legitimacy. It makes the government vulnerable for a con. For the pro, argues that this is false, that it does not make the government vulnerable, and that the idea of compromise isn't the same as concession, so that there is room to compromise without having to concede power. Personally speaking, I don't know where I stand. I'm a bit relativistic. I think it's context specific. Certain instances I can see where concessions could be made, well, not concessions, but compromise could be made. Certain instances I can see where absolutely no compromise, absolutely no concessions could be made. I think it's context specific, and I think the attempt on either case to try and generalize across all terrorist activities, all bargaining dependent terrorist activities, is problematic, right? I think it's context specific. Okay. Crenshaw says, quote, governments also tend to compromise or negotiate than to comply directly. It's very rare that you're going to have complete complicity, right? There's going to be, if it's going to be bargaining dependent, the government is going to obviously safeguard what is the most important in the negotiations. And there are certain things which will not be on the table for discussion. There's many different tools and devices, strategies used in negotiating with terrorist organizations, and I teach on that stuff. But within the context of this video, it's too much information for me to get into on YouTube. Plus, I think the depth that I'm getting into on YouTube is hella deep, right? It's pretty deep to begin with. Okay, so next we move to international cooperation in combating terrorism, right? In an attempt to combat the proliferation and the expansion of terrorism internationally, the first thing to recognize is that terrorism, quote unquote, obviously this is assuming that terrorism exists as something to be fought. There is a very large group of academics that refuse to accept that terrorism is something to which an individual state can fight against, right? That terrorism, as I said in the introduction, is nothing more than a ploy used to justify invasion and so on, other atrocities. I think either extreme, that terrorism is something that can be fought or that terrorism doesn't exist, I think either of those are both too extreme. I think the main line is that terrorism as an act, not an idea, exists, and that those specific instances of terrorist activity can be thwarted with enough awareness and understanding. However, it's not the responsibility of any one nation or any one state to pacify, to suppress terrorism. It's an international, especially within the era of globalization, right? Our global, and as I said earlier, I've just completed a book writing about sort of globalization and international threat, international terror, as a global network. Our economic contingencies and dependencies are interwoven within every single market within the world. So what happens in Bangladesh, in an economic market in Bangladesh, affects me somehow here in the United States of America. And obviously disruptions in that economic market because of an escalation in terror in that segment of the world is somehow going to influence me economically, right? The idea, this pre-Cold War state of affairs in which it was communists versus Democrats, or it's communism versus democracy, that era is done. We are all, on an international level, globally contingent. And since our global contingency, economic contingency, is affected by the levels of peace, the levels of terror, then we all have a global economic responsibility, my argument, to pacify terrorist activity. Because in the end, it hurts the bottom dollar, the thing that means the most, money, right? Because money talks. So that international, the first recognition is that international cooperation is an integral part of counterterrorism. You cannot successfully talk about a state-specific counterterrorism, right? There might be counterterrorism within the United States for domestic terrorism, for sure. But if the United States is targeted, as it was in the September 11th attacks, the question is, why should people in Spain care about the United States being attacked? Why should people in England care about the United States being attacked? Why should people in India care about the United States being attacked? Because as we've seen before, in the displacement effect, the fact that the United States was targeted means that the United States is going to increase its security. The fact that it increases its security means that terrorist organizations are going to displace future attacks to non-Western, non-American targets, so that everybody's vulnerable, right? Because the one thing that you can rest assured with terrorists is that they're not just going to attack one target. They'll kill anybody, right? Anybody who doesn't believe what they believe is target is subject for extermination, right? So that counterterrorism, C-O-N-T-E-R-T-E-R, counterterrorism is an international responsibility. Counterterrorism is an international responsibility, right? It's not the United States' responsibility, it's not Britain's responsibility, it's not China's responsibility. It's an international responsibility of every government, every country in the world to fight, quote-unquote, terrorism. I wouldn't use the language fight terrorism because I don't believe that terrorism can be fought. What I would say properly, sort of academically, it is that it's the global responsibility of every nation in the world to increase awareness and decrease specific threats of terrorism within their territorial jurisdictions, right? If the threat of the United States terror decreases and Britain decreases and India decreases, then collectively the threat has decreased. And we can talk about a very abstract concept of terrorism being diminished without having to sort of resort to this ethereal concept of terror. No, by that I mean instances of terror within the United States as statistically demonstrably verifiable have decreased X number, X percent since 2001, right? That is fact-based reasoning. And for me, that's the only reasoning that's of any importance. Anything else is, it's superfluous, it's spooky, it's ethereal, and I personally, I don't have time to entertain, the boogeyman argument.